Providing armor support for the initial wave of assault troops was a critical concern for the planners of Operation Sea Lion, the German invasion of the United Kingdom. Much effort was devoted to finding practical ways of rapidly getting tanks onto the invasion beaches in support of the first echelon. Though the German barges could disembark several medium tanks onto an open beach, this could be accomplished only once the tide had fallen further and the barges were firmly grounded along their full length. Otherwise, the leading tank might topple off an unsteady ramp and block those behind from deployment. The time needed for assembling the external ramps also meant that both the tanks and the ramp assembly crews would be exposed to close-quarter enemy fire for a considerable time. A safer and faster method was needed, and the Germans eventually settled on providing some tanks with floats and making others fully submersible. It was nevertheless recognized that a high proportion of these specialized tanks might be expected not to make it off the beach. The Tauchpanzer, or deep wading tank, was a standard Panzer III or Panzer IV medium tank with its hull made completely waterproof by sealing all sighting ports, hatches and air intakes with tape. The gap between the turret and hull was sealed with an inflatable hose, while the main gun mantlet, the commander's cupola and the radio operator's machine gun were given special rubber coverings. Once the tank reached the shore, all covers and seals could be blown off via explosive cables, enabling normal combat operation. Fresh air for both the crew and engine was drawn into the tank via an 80-meter-long rubber hose to which a float was attached to keep one end above the water's surface. A radio antenna was also attached to the float to provide communication between the tank crew and the transport barge. The tank's engine was converted to be cooled with seawater, and the exhaust pipes were fitted with overpressure valves. Any water seeping into the tank's hull could be expelled by an internal pump. Navigation underwater was accomplished using a directional compass or by simply following instructions radioed from the transport barge. Experiments conducted at the end of June and early July of 1940 near Wilhelmshaven showed that the submersible tanks functioned best when they were kept moving along the seabed, as, if halted for any reason, they tended to sink into the seabed and remain stuck there. Obstacles such as underwater trenches or large rocks tended to stop the tanks in their tracks, and it was decided for this reason that they should be landed at high tide so that any mired tank could be retrieved at low tide. Submersible tanks could operate in water up to a depth of 15 meters. The German Navy initially expected to use 50 specially converted motor coasters to transport the submersible tanks, but testing with the coaster Germania showed this to be impractical. This was due to the ballast needed to offset the weight of the tanks and the requirement that the coasters be grounded to prevent them from capsizing, as the tanks were transferred by crane onto the vessel's wooden side ramps. By the end of August, the Germans had converted 160 Panzer III tanks and 42 Panzer IV tanks. These gave them a paper strength of 200 tanks, about an equivalent number to those that would otherwise have been allocated to an armored division. The tanks were divided into 4 battalions labeled Sonderpanzerabteilung or Special Armored Battalion A, B, C and D. These battalions consisted of a battalion HQ with 2 Tauchpanzer Befehlswagen 3 command tanks with more powerful radio sets, and 3 panzer companies, each containing 3 platoons. They were to carry sufficient fuel and ammunition for a combat radius of 200 kilometers. The typical mission for Tauchpanzers engaged in amphibious operations involved transport by sea, using pontoons equipped with 25-ton cranes up to a distance of 2,000 meters from the objective. The crane lowered the tank, already prepared for underwater use, onto a maximum depth of 5 meters. Freed from the crane, the tank moved autonomously towards the shore under the guidance of an observer who communicated with the crew via radio. Having reached the shore by its own means, the Tauchpanzer was made fully operational by the crew members, who removed the rubber seals from the hatches, visors and armament, dismantled the air duct and opened the bulkheads. One cannot fail to make into account the state of mind of the tank crew, forced to remain for a rather long period closed in a trap from which, in the event of failure, there was no possible escape. Not having foreseen the possibility of proceeding with the flooding of the tank during the submerged movement in order to allow the opening of the doors, and the abandonment of the vehicle constituted a very serious mistake and determined the failure of the entire program. The Tauchpanzer was received with extreme disfavor by the crews of the Sonderpanzerabteilungen, entirely made up of highly motivated volunteers, due to the absolute impossibility of abandoning the tank in case of necessity, more than due to be expected unconventional use and the limitations of a technical nature specific to the machine. The invasion of the United Kingdom was finally abandoned, but the 4 tank battalions, 2 would form the 18th Panzer Regiment and the other 2 the 28th Panzer Regiment. During the first hours of Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, these regiments were used to cross the Bug River. Of the original special equipment, the tanks retained only the rubber gaskets, the metal bulkheads for closing the air intakes, and the metal supports for the protective coverings mounted around the tower. This modification was decided to put the tanks into a position to cross waterways with a maximum depth of 3 meters, in view of crossing large rivers during the advance into Soviet territory. The Tauchpanzers continued to operate as normal tanks, and there is no information of their further use for submerged river crossings. They participated in combat against the Soviet army until the autumn of 1941, when they were decommissioned and replaced with standard tanks. It is interesting to note that the intended use for the Tauchpanzers differed substantially from the theory developed by the Allies on the use of duplex drive tanks in the framework of amphibious operations. Although exposed to enemy defensive fire and very vulnerable, the DD tanks operated in a conventional manner during the approach to the coast, contrary to what occurred in the case of the Tauchpanzer. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss my future work, please make sure you are subscribed to my channel and press the bell notification button. Thank you, and see you in the next video.